The gondolas outside the Palazzo something or other were still rocking from the last wave when Soren Vance walked through the front doors like a man who had never once needed a cane. Because tonight, he didn't. 6 months ago, doctors in Geneva told him he would never see again. And Soren Vance, feared across 3 continents as the man who ran the Vance Syndicate from the shadows, had gone blind in the middle of a war he started. Tonight, his eyes worked perfectly, and nobody in this ballroom knew it yet. He stood at the top of the marble staircase, dressed in black, unannounced, uninvited, and completely calm. Chandeliers the size of small cars threw gold light across 300 guests in gowns and tuxedos. String quartet in the corner. Champagne towers. The kind of wedding that costs more than some country's GDP. And there, at the altar, in a white dress that looked like it had been stitched from moonlight, stood Lyra, his Lyra. The woman who had spent 4 months feeding him soup because his hands shook too badly to hold a spoon. The woman who had read him poetry when the darkness got too loud in his head. The woman who had disappeared 11 days ago without a single word, leaving nothing behind but an unmade bed and a note that said, "I'm sorry," nothing else. He'd searched every safe house, every contact, every favor he was owed across Europe, and now here she was, about to marry Casper Thorne, a man whose smile belonged on a shark. Lyra saw him first. Her whole body went rigid, like someone had poured ice water down her spine. Her bouquet trembled. She didn't call out. She didn't run to him. She just stared, eyes wide with something that looked less like joy and more like terror. That wasn't the reaction of a woman happy to see the man she loved. That was the reaction of a woman who thought her secret was still safe. Soren didn't wait for the priest to ask if anyone objected. He didn't need the theatrics. He simply raised one hand, and every head in that ballroom turned toward him, the stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere, walking down the center aisle like he owned the building, because in 3 different shell companies, he technically did. "Stop the wedding," he said. Not loud, he didn't need loud. The room had already gone silent on its own. Casper Thorne turned, and for exactly 1 second, Soren watched something flicker behind the man's eyes. Not confusion, not anger, fear. That single flicker told Soren everything he needed to know. Casper recognized him. Casper had expected this, which meant Casper had planned for it. But Soren had planned harder. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim leather folder, the one Orion had spent 3 sleepless weeks assembling. He didn't hand it to Casper. He walked straight past the groom, past the stunned priest, past Lyra, who flinched as he passed her, like she expected him to be angry with her, and placed it directly into the hands of a silver-haired woman standing near the back with 2 quiet men in gray suits. Inspector Elena Rossi. European Financial Crimes Division. Soren had called in a favor from a man who owed him a favor from a woman who owed him a favor, and here she was, holding proof of 11 offshore accounts, 4 shell corporations, and enough laundered money to bankrupt a small nation. Rossi opened the folder. Read one line. Looked up at Casper Thorne with the expression of a woman who had just found Christmas early. "Mr. Thorne," she said, loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear, "you're going to want to sit down." Chaos didn't happen slowly. It happened all at once, like a held breath, finally releasing. Guests gasped. Someone dropped a champagne flute, and it shattered against the marble. Casper's mother screamed. 2 of the gray-suited men moved toward Casper, who backed away, insisting this was a mistake, a setup, lies, while his face went the color of old paper. Cameras. Because of course there were cameras. This was the wedding of the season. began flashing from every direction. Reporters who'd been invited to cover a fairy tale were suddenly covering a scandal, and scandal always sold better. In the middle of it all, Soren finally let himself look at Lyra. She hadn't moved. She stood frozen in her wedding dress, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears cutting through carefully applied makeup. And when their eyes finally met properly, really met, the way they used to in the quiet dark of his study, when he couldn't see her face, but could hear every word she wasn't saying, she didn't look relieved. She looked afraid for him. Not of him, for him. Which made no sense at all, and Soren didn't have time to untangle it, because security was already shouting, because Casper was already screaming his name like a curse, because Inspector Rossi was radioing for backup, and because in about 90 seconds, this entire palazzo was going to be crawling with police, who had a lot of questions for a man who supposedly didn't exist anymore. He crossed the last few feet between them in 3 strides, grabbed her gloved hand. She didn't pull away, not even a little, and pulled her toward the side exit he'd already scouted 20 minutes earlier. "Soren, wait," she started, voice breaking. "Later," he said. "Right now we move." Behind them, the ballroom dissolved into full pandemonium, a bride vanishing through a side door, with a man everyone thought was a ghost, a groom being led away by federal agents, 300 of Europe's wealthiest guests, live streaming the collapse of an empire. And as Soren pulled Lyra out into the cold Venice night, one thought sat heavy in his chest, underneath the adrenaline, underneath the relief of finally seeing her face again with his own 2 eyes. She hadn't run to him. She'd looked terrified when she saw him. Something was very wrong here, and it wasn't just Casper Thorne. The water taxi cut through the Venice canals like a blade through silk, engine growling low, no running lights. Soren kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on the mirror, watching for anything that looked like pursuit. Behind them, sirens were already threading through the narrow streets, red and blue light bouncing off centuries-old stone. Lyra sat across from him, still in her wedding dress, a stolen coat from the palazzo's cloakroom wrapped around her shoulders. She hadn't said a word since they'd left. She just watched the city slide past, her jaw tight, her hands twisted together in her lap, like she was holding herself in one piece by force. He didn't push her, not yet. There would be time for questions once they weren't actively fleeing a crime scene. By the time they reached the mainland, he'd arranged a car through a contact who asked no questions and got well paid for it. They drove through the night toward Verona, the silence between them heavier than anything Soren had carried in years, heavier than blindness, heavier than the bullet that caused it. It was past midnight when they reached the railway station, the old one, mostly empty this late, lit by a handful of buzzing overhead lamps and nothing else. A freight train sat idle on a far track. Somewhere, a vending machine hummed. It felt like the last quiet place left in Italy. Soren finally stopped walking, right there on the empty platform, and turned to face her. "Talk to me," he said. "Now. No more waiting." Lyra flinched at his tone, but she didn't look away. In the harsh station light, he could finally see what the ballroom chandeliers had hidden, the exhaustion carved under her eyes, the way her hands trembled even now, hours after the wedding had collapsed. "You want the truth," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "The truth is, I left because staying would have gotten you finished. I don't need you to protect me, Lyra. I've survived worse than—" "You were blind, Soren." The words came out sharp, almost angry, but underneath the anger was something closer to grief. You couldn't see the men following you. You couldn't see the photographs Casper had, of your estate, your safe houses, the exact chair you sat in every morning to drink your coffee. He had everything, because I was careless, because I let myself fall for you when I should have been more careful about who might be watching me. Soren felt something cold settle in his stomach. Casper knew where I was. He's known for months. She wrapped her arms around herself, the borrowed coat, doing nothing against whatever cold she was actually feeling. He came to me 6 weeks ago, showed me photos of your chalet, your car, your routine, things only someone watching very closely could have gathered. He told me plainly, marry him, or he sells your location to the Kovalenko syndicate. The name hit Soren like a slap. The Kovalenkos had wanted him gone for 3 years, ever since he'd dismantled their weapons pipeline through Marseille and humiliated their patriarch in front of half of Europe's underworld. If they'd known he was blind, defenseless, tucked away in a chalet with only a handful of guards who thought they were protecting a retired businessman, it wouldn't have been an assassination. It would have been a slaughter. He weaponized you, Soren said quietly, more to himself than to her. He didn't want you. He wanted leverage. He wanted the marriage to look legitimate, Lyra said. Society wedding, respectable bride, nobody asking questions about why a failing hedge fund manager suddenly had access to sterling family assets. But the real prize was always you. He knew if I married him, I'd stop being a threat to expose what he was doing, and he knew I'd never let anything happen to you. Not after everything. Her voice broke fully now, the composure she'd been holding on to for 11 days, finally giving out. So I left. I didn't say goodbye, because if I'd looked at you one more time, I wouldn't have been able to do it. Soren stood there for a long moment, station lights humming overhead, the freight train groaning somewhere in the dark, and felt 11 days of fury and confusion rearrange themselves into something entirely different. She hadn't left because she didn't love him. She'd left because she did. You should have told me, he said, quieter now. Told a blind man in hiding that a Kovalenko hit squad might be coming for him. She let out a broken laugh. You would have gone to war, Soren. You would have burned down half of Casper's world trying to protect me, and you couldn't even see your own front door. I couldn't watch you die for me, not when I still had a choice to prevent it. He crossed the platform and took her face in both hands, gently, the way he used to when he was memorizing the shape of her by touch, because his eyes couldn't do the job anymore. She didn't pull away this time. You don't get to make that decision alone, he said. Not anymore. Whatever Casper is planning, whatever this actually is, we face it together, or we don't face it at all. Lyra searched his face for a long moment, like she was trying to decide if she believed him. Then, finally, she nodded, small, exhausted, but real. There's more, she whispered. Things about my brother, about why any of this started in the first place. I don't think Casper's threat against you was ever the whole story. Somewhere behind them, a train whistle cut through the night, and Soren felt the ground shift beneath a story he thought he'd already understood. The chalet looked exactly as Soren remembered it, which was strange, because he'd never actually seen it before. He knew its shape by touch. The rough-hewn beam by the front door he used to duck under, out of habit, long after his ribs had healed from ducking too late once. The exact number of steps from the kitchen to the fireplace. The particular creak of the third floorboard in the hallway, the one Lyra used to warn him about every single morning without fail. Now, walking through the front door with his own working eyes, he saw it all for the first time. Dark timber walls, a wall of windows facing the Alps, snow-capped peaks glowing faint blue in the pre-dawn light. A worn leather chair by the fire, his chair, the one Lyra always steered him toward with a light hand on his elbow. It felt like stepping into a memory he'd only ever heard described. "It's smaller than I imagined," he said, mostly to break the silence that had followed them the entire drive from Verona. Lyra managed a faint, tired smile. "You always said it was too big. Said you kept bumping into furniture you swore wasn't there before. I lied. I liked complaining. It gave you something to laugh at. That earned a real laugh, short, surprised out of her, and for a moment, the 11 days of distance between them cracked open just slightly. He doubled security the moment they arrived. 4 of his most trusted men now watched the perimeter, armed and alert, a precaution he never would have needed before, but couldn't risk skipping now, not with the Kovalenko threat hanging over everything. Still, inside the chalet, it was just the 2 of them, the fire, and 4 months of unfinished conversation. Lyra changed out of the wedding dress into simple clothes Soren didn't recognize, clothes that weren't hers, weren't from this house, clothes she must have kept hidden somewhere, for exactly this kind of emergency. That detail alone told him she'd been preparing to run for longer than 11 days. She sat across from him by the fire, knees pulled up, wrapped in a blanket that used to be his. "You said there was more," Soren said gently, "about your brother." Lyra's face changed instantly, grief moving in like weather. "Leo," she said, like the name itself cost her something. "My little brother. He's 26, brilliant, reckless, and he spent the last 3 years making every wrong decision a person can make." She stared into the fire. About 8 months ago, he started gambling, not casually, desperately. Private games, high stakes, the kind of rooms where the house always wins, and the house is usually connected to people far more dangerous than a card table suggests. "Casper's rooms," Soren said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. Leo lost everything. His savings, his apartment, money he didn't even have. By the time I found out, he owed Casper Thorne nearly 2 million euros, and Casper doesn't forgive debts. He collects them. Her hands tightened around the blanket. He told me if I didn't find a way to pay it back, he'd make sure Leo disappeared. Permanently. I believed him. I still believe him. "So you took the job in my house. I needed money, and I needed to disappear myself for a while. Casper's people were watching Leo, which meant they might start watching me too. A friend of a friend mentioned a reclusive businessman in the Alps who needed a live-in caretaker after an accident left him blind. No questions asked, generous pay, complete privacy." Her voice softened. "I told myself it was just a job, just 6 months, enough to save what I needed for Leo's debt. And then you turned out to be nothing like I expected," she said quietly, finally looking at him. "You were furious and stubborn and impossible for the first month, and then you weren't. You let me see you when you couldn't see anyone seeing you. The fear, the grief over losing your sight, the nights you couldn't sleep because you kept dreaming you could still see, and waking up to darkness all over again. Nobody in your world gets to see that side of you. I did, and somewhere in there, this stopped being a job." Soren felt something in his chest tighten, an old ache finally finding words. "For me too," he admitted. "I used to lie awake and try to guess what you looked like from your voice alone. I told myself it didn't matter. It mattered more than anything." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, wind moved through the pines, and somewhere far below, the lights of a small village blinked against the dark valley floor. "Casper found out about us," Lyra continued eventually. "I don't know how. Maybe he had someone watching the chalet. Maybe Leo said something he shouldn't have. But he came to me directly, told me he'd cancel Leo's debt entirely, forgive the whole 2 million, if I married him instead, and he made it clear that if I refused, he wouldn't just hurt Leo. She swallowed hard. He'd expose your location to anyone willing to pay for it. He knew exactly what that would mean for a blind man with a syndicate's worth of enemies. So you traded yourself, Soren said, to save both of us. I didn't see another option. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. I still don't know if I chose right. I know it nearly cost me you. Soren reached across the space between them and took her hand, the way he had 100 nights in this exact house, when his world had been nothing but sound and touch, and her voice keeping him tethered to something real. You chose to survive, he said. That's not weakness. Lyra, that's the only thing that ever made sense in a world like mine. He paused, jaw tightening. But Casper made a mistake tonight. He forgot that a man who built an empire in the dark doesn't need his sight to burn someone's life down. Lyra searched his face, something flickering behind her eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear of hoping too soon. There's one more thing, she said slowly. Something about Leo I only found out a few days ago. Something that doesn't add up. She hesitated, like she wasn't sure she wanted to say it out loud. I don't think Leo was just a victim in all this. I think he might have known exactly what he was doing when he brought Casper into our lives. The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed, and Soren felt the shape of the real story finally beginning to surface, darker and far closer to home than either of them had expected. Zurich in the early morning looked like a city built entirely out of glass and secrets, mirrored towers reflecting a gray sky, bankers moving briskly along the Bahnhofstrasse with the particular walk of people who handle other people's fortunes for a living. Soren had always liked this city for exactly that reason. Everyone here already knew how to keep quiet. He met Orion in the back room of a private club, 2 floors below street level, the kind of place with no sign outside, and a membership list that didn't officially exist. Orion had been Soren's right hand for 11 years, the man who ran numbers while Soren ran risk, the only person besides Lyra who'd stayed loyal through the entire blind, brutal stretch after the shooting. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, which, knowing Orion, he probably hadn't. You look terrible, Soren said, sitting down across from him. You look like a man who crashed a wedding on live television. Orion shot back, sliding a thick folder across the table. Rossi's arrest of Casper is already everywhere. Half of Europe thinks you're either a hero or a lunatic. The other half thinks you're both. I can live with that. Soren tapped the folder. Tell me this is about Leo. Orion's expression shifted, the easy sarcasm draining out of it, replaced by something careful, almost reluctant. It is. And I need you to understand, before I show you any of this, that I checked it 3 times. I didn't want it to be true either. That warning alone told Soren this was worse than he'd braced for. He opened the folder. Bank transfers, encrypted message logs, decrypted now, laid out in cold black print. Photographs of Leo, Lyra's brother, the reckless person she'd spent years protecting, the man she'd sold herself into a marriage to save, sitting across from Casper Thorne in a private room, smiling, shaking hands, looking nothing like a desperate man drowning in gambling debt. Read the dates, Orion said quietly. Soren did. And the timeline unraveled in front of him like a wire pulled loose from a bomb. Leo hadn't lost 2 million euros to Casper's gambling rooms out of recklessness. The debt itself was manufactured. A paper trail designed from the start. Transfers moving in circles between accounts Leo controlled and shell companies Casper owned. Money that looked lost on paper but had actually been quietly funneled back to Leo in smaller, harder-to-trace payments over the following months. It was never a real debt, Soren said slowly, the words tasting like ash. It was a setup, from the beginning. Worse than that. Orion pulled out another page, a message log dated nearly a year earlier, long before the supposed gambling losses had even started. Leo approached Casper first, not the other way around. Soren stared at the screenshot, a message from Leo's account, sent to an intermediary who worked for Casper. My sister has access to the Sterling Vault. If we can get her married into the right family, that access becomes permanent. I need capital, and I need this handled quietly. The floor seemed to tilt slightly under Soren's chair. The Sterling family, Soren said. Lyra's family. Orion nodded grimly. Before her parents were gone, the Sterlings were quietly one of the oldest art-collecting dynasties in Europe. Not flashy about it. No museum wings with their name on them, nothing public. Just generations of careful, private acquisition. Renaissance pieces, lost war-era paintings, things that were never catalogued, never insured publicly, never appraised by anyone who'd talk. The vault under the family estate in Florence is worth, conservatively, hundreds of millions, possibly more. Nobody knows the real number because nobody outside the family has ever seen the full inventory. And Casper needed capital, Soren said, the pieces sliding into place with sickening speed. His firm's been bleeding money for over a year. I know. I had people watching him the moment Lyra mentioned his name in Verona. Failed investments, a fund about to collapse, investors asking questions he can't answer. He needed something to quietly liquidate, Orion confirmed. Something with no public paper trail, no auction records, nothing traceable back to him. Uncatalogued art is close to perfect for that. Sell pieces off slowly, through private collectors, nobody the wiser, and he covers the hole in his firm before anyone realizes it exists. But he needed access to the vault. And the only way in was through the family. Through Lyra, Orion said. And Leo delivered her. Soren sat back, the folder heavy in his hands, feeling something colder than rage settle into his chest. A quiet, focused fury he hadn't felt since the night he first learned who'd put a bullet near his skull. Lyra had spent months tearing herself apart with guilt, believing she'd failed to protect a brother who'd needed saving. She'd married herself off to a predator to shield a person who had, in fact, orchestrated the entire trap from the very beginning. Does she know? Orion asked carefully. No. Soren closed the folder slowly, and I need to be the one to tell her. Not because I want to break her heart. His jaw tightened, because I want to see her face when she understands exactly how deep this goes, and because I need her steady enough to help me end it. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Casper needs that vault more than he needs anything else in the world right now, and Leo just handed him a golden key. Soren stood, the folder tucked under his arm, his mind already 3 moves ahead, the way it used to work before the bullet, before the darkness, before he'd had to relearn how to be dangerous without his eyes. Which means, if we get to that vault first, if Lyra locks her own brother out of the one thing Casper actually needs, we don't just protect the art. We cut off his only way to survive, Orion finished. Exactly. Soren's voice went flat and cold, the tone Orion hadn't heard in months, the tone that used to make grown men in this city reconsider entire business decisions. Casper thought he'd built an empire on other people's secrets. Let's see how well it stands once every one of them is gone. Outside the club, Zurich's gray morning had turned to rain, streaking down the mirrored towers like the city itself was trying to wash something clean. Soren thought of Lyra back at the chalet, unaware that the brother she'd sacrificed everything for had never needed saving at all, and felt, for the first time since regaining his sight, exactly how much darker this world could still get, even in broad daylight. Telling her was the hardest thing Soren had done since learning to walk downstairs without a cane. He'd chosen the chalet's library, the two of them alone, the fire low and quiet, because he wanted her to have somewhere soft to fall apart if she needed to. He laid the folder on the table between them and told her everything, slowly, without softening a single detail. The manufactured debt, the message Leo had sent nearly a year before any of this began, the vault, the plan that had used her like a key cut, specifically to fit one lock. Lyra didn't cry. That surprised him more than anything else that night. She sat very still, reading each page twice, her face going pale and then strangely calm, like grief that had already burned through shock and landed somewhere colder. When she finally looked up, her eyes weren't wet. They were furious. "He let me believe I was saving him," she said quietly, "for months. He let me sell myself to a man I despised, and the entire time, he was the one who built the cage." "We don't have to move on this tonight," Soren said. "You don't owe anyone a reaction right now." "No." She stood, folder still in her hand, spine straight in a way he hadn't seen since Verona. "We move tonight, before Casper realizes we know. Before Leo has time to finish whatever he started." They reached the Sterling estate outside Florence, a little past midnight, 2 days later, having spent that time quietly confirming through Orion's contacts that Casper, out on bail, awaiting trial, but far from finished, had indeed sent people toward the property. The estate itself sat behind old stone walls, ivy climbing toward shuttered windows, the kind of quiet grandeur that photographed beautifully and revealed nothing about what it actually protected. Lyra let them in through a side entrance only family knew existed, moving with the sure-footed familiarity of someone who'd grown up chasing her little brother through these same halls. Soren followed close behind, senses sharp, his men positioned discreetly outside the walls in case Casper's people were already closer than expected. The vault sat 2 floors beneath the east wing, behind a door that looked, from the outside, like nothing more than an old wine cellar. Lyra entered a code on a panel, disguised as a light switch, and the door released with a heavy metallic sigh. Light spilled out from inside. Someone was already there. Lyra froze in the doorway. Soren's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket before he registered who he was looking at. Leo stood in the middle of the vault, surrounded by centuries of quietly extraordinary art, canvases stacked against the walls, a Caravaggio-style portrait leaning half-wrapped against a crate, gold frames catching the low light like buried treasure finally unearthed. He had a case open on a table, 3 paintings already removed from their frames and rolled carefully inside, tools laid out with the efficiency of a man who'd clearly done this kind of work before, or at least studied how. He turned at the sound of the door and went white. "Lyra," he said, and for one brief second, Soren watched the old Leo flicker across his face. The brother, the person she'd raised half herself after their parents finished, scared and caught. Then something harder settled over his features instead, something that looked almost relieved to finally stop pretending. "You weren't supposed to be here yet." "Yet?" Lyra repeated, the word landing like a blade. "So there was a schedule, a plan, all of it, the debt, the marriage, everything you let me believe I was doing to save you." Her voice shook, but she didn't back down. "You were never in danger, were you?" "I was in danger," Leo snapped, some old defensiveness sparking under the calm. "Just not the kind you think. Do you know what it's like watching this family sit on hundreds of millions in art nobody's allowed to touch, while I couldn't even pay rent? You inherited the name, Lyra. I inherited nothing but the debt of being born second. So you sold me, she said, and her voice finally cracked, to a man like Casper Thorne. For a cut of a vault, you had no right to touch either. I was going to make sure you were taken care of, Leo said, though even he didn't seem to believe it, as the words left his mouth. Casper promised. Casper promised you money to help him rob a dying firm back to life, Soren cut in, stepping fully into the vault now, his voice low and controlled in the way that used to make far more dangerous men than Leo go quiet. And once he had what he needed from this room, do you honestly think he'd have kept his word to either of you? Leo's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Lyra crossed the room slowly, past canvases worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, and stopped directly in front of her brother. Up close, in the vault's low light, she looked less like a woman about to break, and more like someone finally, fully done bending. I spent months hating myself, she said quietly, for not being able to save you fast enough. I married a stranger to protect you from a debt that never existed. I would have burned my own life down for you, Leo, and you let me, because it was convenient. Her eyes glistened, but her voice stayed steady. That ends tonight. She turned to the wall panel beside the vault entrance, entered a second code, one Leo clearly hadn't expected her to know, and a soft chime confirmed the change. Family trust access. Revoked. Effective immediately. Leo's name blinked once on the small screen and disappeared from the authorized list entirely. Lyra, wait. Leo started forward, panic finally cracking through. You don't get to touch this family's legacy again, she said, stepping back to stand beside Soren, her shoulders squared, despite the tremor still running through her hands. Not the vault, not me. Whatever's left between us, you'll have to earn it back from a courtroom, not a wine cellar. Soren watched her, something fierce and proud tightening in his chest, and understood, watching this woman who'd spent months believing she was too soft, too sentimental, too easily used, that Casper Thorne had just lost the one asset he'd been counting on more than any other. The vault door sealed behind them with a heavy final sound. Somewhere north of Florence, a phone would ring soon, and Casper would learn his lifeline had just been cut, and Soren intended to make absolutely sure the man understood exactly whose hands had done the cutting. Casper Thorne learned about the vault within 6 hours, and he did exactly what Soren expected a cornered man to do. He panicked in public. By morning, Italian tabloids were running a story that hadn't come from Rossi's office or any legitimate source, a story painted entirely in Casper's favor, claiming that Lyra Sterling had been kidnapped from her own wedding by a dangerous fugitive with underworld ties, that she was being held against her will in the Alps, that authorities needed to intervene immediately before the victim came to further harm. There were grainy photos of Soren from years ago, back when he still ran his empire in the open, captioned with words like trafficking and coercion and danger. It was garbage. It was also working. He's good, Orion admitted grimly over the phone, Soren pacing the length of the chalet's library with his jaw tight. 2 networks picked it up by 9 a.m. Public opinion's already shifting. People love a rescue story more than a truth. He's not trying to win public opinion, Soren said. He's trying to force police intervention before Rossi finishes building the fraud case. If authorities move on a kidnapping report, they pull me in for questioning. Maybe worse, and it buys him time to disappear the money that's left, restructure the firm, bury what's coming. Lyra stood by the window, arms crossed, watching snow drift over the peaks outside, her face unreadable in a way that worried Soren more than tears would have. Then we take that time away from him, she said finally, publicly, before he gets the chance to use it. That was how, 3 days later, they found themselves standing backstage at a hastily arranged press conference in the heart of Milan's fashion district. A bold, almost reckless move, but one that put Lyra in full control of a story that had, until now, only ever been told by other people. The venue was small and heavily guarded. 4 of Soren's men stationed at every entrance, plain clothes, watching every face in the crowd of journalists filing in. Rossi had agreed to attend, careful to stay visible but silent, a quiet signal that the authorities weren't entirely convinced by Casper's story either. Orion worked the room beforehand, feeding select details to 2 reporters he trusted not to twist them. "You don't have to do this," Soren said quietly, watching Lyra check her reflection one last time in a dressing room mirror, dressed simply, deliberately. No designer gown this time, nothing that looked staged. "We could fight this through lawyers, slower, but safer." "Slower helps Casper," she said. "He needs slow. He needs confusion. I'm done giving him either." She turned to face him, and for the first time since Venice, he saw something steady return to her eyes. Not the fear from the ballroom, not the grief from the vault, but something closer to the woman who used to run this chalet like she owned every inch of it. "I want to look the cameras in the eye and take my own story back." She walked out onto that small stage without notes, without hesitation, and told the truth. She spoke about the manufactured debt, the message logs Orion had traced back nearly a year, the vault Casper had engineered an entire marriage to access. She didn't mention Leo's full role. Some wounds, Soren understood, she still needed time to close privately. But she was unflinching about Casper, describing the threat against Soren's life, the coercion, the extortion, in clear, steady sentences that left no room for doubt about who the real predator in this story had been. Then, in the final minutes, she delivered the line Soren hadn't fully expected, one she'd decided on herself only that morning. "My family's art collection has sat in private for 3 generations, she said, cameras flashing in a steady, relentless rhythm. "Pieces the public has never seen, pieces worth more than any single family should quietly control. I'm liquidating the collection, not to a private buyer, not to cover anyone's debts, but through public auction, with the proceeds funding an international restoration foundation. Every piece will finally be seen, catalogued, and shared." The room erupted into questions, but Soren watched only one face in the crowd, a face that had appeared in the back near the exit sometime during Lyra's speech, half hidden behind a photographer's shoulder. Casper. He hadn't dared approach, not with Rossi and half of Milan's press in the room, but he was there, watching his last remaining lifeline dissolve in real time. If the vault's contents went to public auction with full transparency, there was no quiet, untraceable liquidation left for him to exploit. No shadow market for uncatalogued masterpieces. No hidden capital injection to save his collapsing firm. Lyra had just burned the ground out from under him, in front of every camera in Italy. After the conference, backstage again, away from the noise, Lyra's composure finally cracked. Not from fear this time, but from something that looked almost like relief, breaking loose all at once. Soren caught her before her knees fully gave out, holding her steady the way he used to hold himself steady during the worst months of the darkness. "I meant every word," she said against his shoulder, voice shaking now that the cameras were gone. "I don't want that vault anymore. Not like this. Not as something people fight and lie and marry each other over." "You just took away the only thing keeping Casper's firm alive," Soren murmured into her hair. "He's not going to let that go quietly." "I know," she pulled back. meeting his eyes, and despite the exhaustion, despite everything, there was steel there now that hadn't existed in the woman who'd fled a wedding 11 days ago. So let him come. I'm done running from this. Whatever he tries next, I want to be standing right in front of it. Outside, Milan's streets buzzed with the story already spreading. Sterling heiress exposes fraud, reclaims her family's legacy, denies kidnapping, but Soren felt no comfort in the headlines. Cornered men didn't retreat quietly, and somewhere in this city, or maybe already fleeing it, Casper Thorne was almost certainly planning something far more desperate than a press campaign. They should have known Casper wouldn't disappear quietly. Men who build empires on other people's secrets rarely go down without dragging someone else into the wreckage with them. The villa on the Amalfi coast belonged to an old associate of Soren's, a retired shipping magnate who owed him enough favors to lend out a cliffside estate without asking questions. It seemed like the safest place to let the dust settle after Milan. White stone walls, a private stretch of coastline, nothing but sea air and distance between them and the chaos they'd left behind. For 6 days, it almost felt like peace. Lyra started sleeping through the night again. Soren caught himself, more than once, simply watching the way morning light moved across her face, still amazed that he could. It ended on the 7th night. Soren heard the trouble before he saw it. Tires on gravel where no cars should be, voices near the gate that didn't belong to his men. He was moving before the first shout even reached him, pulling Lyra from bed, pushing her toward the reinforced safe room built into the villa's lower level, when the front door came apart under something heavier than a boot. By the time he reached the main hall, 4 of Casper's hired men had already overpowered 2 of his own security detail, zip-tied and shoved against the wall, and Casper himself stood in the center of the room like a man who believed he'd finally won something. He looked worse than the last time Soren had seen him. Thinner, wired, expensive suit hanging slightly loose, like he hadn't eaten properly in days. Beside him stood a heavy-set man in a rumpled linen jacket that Soren recognized instantly. Judge Alessio Bruni, a name that had come up more than once in Orion's research on corrupt local officials still willing to backdate paperwork for the right price. "You've made this very difficult, Soren," Casper said, and his voice had lost the polished calm from the wedding. This was a man improvising, and badly. The vault, the press conference, the auction announcement. Do you understand what you've cost me? "I understand exactly what I've cost you," Soren said, not moving from where he stood, keeping himself between Casper's men and the hallway leading to the safe room. "Everything. That's usually what happens to men who build their empires on extortion. I have a solution." Casper gestured to Bruni, who produced a folded document from his jacket with visibly shaking hands. "A marriage license, dated 3 weeks ago, before your little rescue in Venice. Judge Bruni here is prepared to certify it as legitimate, backdated through proper channels. Once Lyra signs, the wedding stands. Legally, she's my wife, which means everything in that vault, everything in the Sterling Trust, becomes marital property, mine to control, regardless of what she announced to the cameras. She'll never sign that. She won't need to want to." Casper's smile came back, thin and desperate. "I imagine a man who spent months blind and helpless understands better than anyone how persuasive the right kind of pressure can be." That was the moment Soren stopped negotiating. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply raised 2 fingers, a small, precise gesture he hadn't used in over a year. A signal from the old days, back when the Vance Syndicate name alone was enough to end a room's confidence in itself. Outside, the night erupted with quiet, coordinated movement. Casper's 4 hired men didn't even have time to look properly alarmed before Soren's actual security detail, the real one, 12 men who'd been positioned around the property's perimeter since the moment Soren first suspected Amalfi might not stay peaceful, moved in through every entrance at once. It was fast, disciplined, and almost entirely silent. Zip ties replaced with cold steel handcuffs. Weapons cleared and collected before anyone could raise one in panic. Casper's men, it turned out, had been hired quickly and cheaply, more interested in getting paid than dying for a man whose empire was already publicly collapsing. Not one of them fired a shot. Not one of them even tried. Judge Bruni dropped the marriage document the moment he understood what was happening, holding both hands up, already stammering about being coerced, about only being present under duress. The sudden cowardice of a corrupt man realizing exactly how badly he'd miscalculated which side actually held power in this room. Casper alone stood frozen, watching his last, most desperate gambit disintegrate in real time. "You're finished," Soren said quietly, stepping closer now that the room was fully secured. "Not because of anything I did tonight, because you never once, in this entire scheme, accounted for the fact that the woman you tried to trap is stronger than every plan you've built." As if summoned by the words, Lyra appeared in the hallway behind him. She'd left the safe room the moment the sounds of struggle stopped, unwilling, even now, to stay hidden while decisions about her own life were made without her. She walked past Soren, straight up to Casper, and looked him directly in the eye without a trace of the fear that had gripped her in Venice. "You spent months convincing me I had no choices," she said, "that I owed you my freedom to protect the people I love. You were wrong about that from the very beginning." She looked down at the crumpled marriage document on the floor between them. "I will never sign that. Not tonight. Not ever. And when this is finished, everything you tried to steal will belong to people you can't touch. The public, a foundation, anyone but you." Casper opened his mouth, some last desperate protest forming, but there was nothing left to say. Soren's men had already begun leading him toward a car waiting at the gate, alongside Bruni, both of them destined for a very different kind of conversation with Inspector Rossi than the one Casper had planned tonight. As the sound of engines faded down the cliffside road, Soren finally let himself exhale, pulling Lyra close against him under the wide, star-scattered Amalfi sky. "That's twice now he's underestimated us," she murmured against his chest. "There won't be a third time," Soren said. "Rossi has enough now to end this permanently. Tomorrow we finish it in a courtroom, not a stolen villa in the dead of night." Above them, the sea moved dark and endless against the cliffs, and for the first time since Venice, Soren allowed himself to believe the worst of this nightmare might finally, truly, be behind them. The Rome courthouse smelled like old stone and fresh coffee, a strange combination that somehow made the whole building feel like it was holding its breath. Soren had sat in boardrooms where fortunes were decided in minutes, and back rooms where lives were bargained over in whispers, but nothing quite matched the particular tension of a courtroom where a man's entire empire was about to be dismantled in front of witnesses who couldn't be bought. Lyra sat beside him in the front row, dressed simply, her spine straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She'd insisted on being here for every hour of it, refusing Soren's offer to let Orion and Rossi handle the technical proceedings while she stayed somewhere safer. "I earned the right to watch this end," she'd told him that morning, and he hadn't argued. Casper sat at the defense table, looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 weeks. His expensive suits had started hanging looser each time Soren saw him, and today was no exception. A gray pallor to his skin, eyes darting occasionally toward the gallery, like he was still searching for some exit that didn't exist anymore. Orion took the stand first, walking the court through 18 months of financial records with the calm precision of a man who'd built his entire career on making numbers confess. He laid out the offshore accounts one by one, Casper's failing hedge fund, the desperate restructuring attempts, the shell companies designed purely to obscure a firm hemorrhaging investor money. Then came the harder evidence, the message logs between Casper and Leo, the manufactured gambling debt, the meticulous, cold-blooded engineering of a marriage designed solely to unlock the sterling vault. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Alba Conti, who Rossi had personally recommended, walked the court through each document like she was building a wall brick by brick, leaving no gap for Casper's defense attorney to squeeze through. Mr. Thorne orchestrated a scheme spanning nearly a year, Conti told the judges, manipulating a young man's financial desperation, manufacturing a debt that never legitimately existed, and using that manufactured debt to coerce his sister into a marriage designed purely to access one of Europe's most significant private art collections, art he intended to quietly liquidate to cover fraud he'd already committed against his own investors. Then it was Lyra's turn. Soren watched her walk to the stand with the same steady calm she'd carried into that Milan press conference, and felt something fierce and proud tighten in his chest all over again. She testified clearly, without theatrics, describing the threat Casper had made against Soren's location, the coercion, the months of quiet terror hiding behind a wedding gown everyone else saw as a fairy tale. "He told me," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom, "that if I refused to marry him, he would sell information about a blind man's location to people who wanted him finished." I believed him. I still believe he would have done it without hesitation. Casper's attorney tried, predictably, to paint her testimony as emotional exaggeration, a woman manipulated by a dangerous fugitive into telling a convenient story. But Conti had prepared for exactly that angle, and the paper trail Orion had built left almost nothing for doubt to hide inside. Every accusation Lyra made was backed by a document, a transfer, a message log, with a timestamp that couldn't be argued with. The final piece came from an unexpected direction. Leo appeared as a witness for the prosecution, a deal Rossi had brokered weeks earlier in exchange for reduced charges, though Soren suspected it was less about the deal and more about Leo finally understanding exactly how much he'd cost his sister. He looked smaller on the stand than Soren remembered from the vault, some of the defensive arrogance stripped away, replaced by something closer to genuine shame. "I approached Casper first," Leo admitted, voice barely above a murmur, eyes fixed somewhere on the floor, rather than on Lyra's face. "I told him about the vault. I told him marrying into the family would give him access. It was my idea before it was ever his execution." It was a small mercy, Soren thought, watching Lyra's face carefully. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but at least the truth finally spoken aloud in her presence rather than buried in documents she'd had to read alone. Her jaw tightened, her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away from her brother's confession. She simply absorbed it, standing in it, the way she'd absorbed everything else this past month. The verdict, when it came 2 days later, wasn't close. Casper Thorne was found guilty on charges of financial fraud, extortion, and conspiracy, the judges citing the sheer volume of evidence as leaving no reasonable doubt about the scale and deliberateness of his scheme. The court ordered an immediate seizure of his firm's remaining assets, freezing everything down to accounts Casper likely thought no one had traced. His firm, already collapsing under the weight of its own fraud, was formally dissolved within the week. Leo received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but a sentence nonetheless. Enough time, Soren suspected, for the guy to finally reckon with exactly what his choices had cost the sister who'd spent her whole life protecting him. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited in a crowd twice the size of the one in Milan, shouting questions that blurred together into noise. Soren kept one hand steady at the small of Lyra's back as they descended the marble steps, Rosie walking just ahead to clear a path through the chaos. Lyra didn't stop for questions. She didn't need to anymore. The truth was already a matter of public record, filed away in a courtroom that couldn't be argued with or bribed into silence. She simply walked, chin lifted, out of the shadow that had followed her since the night Casper first showed her those photographs of a blind man's chalet in the mountains. At the bottom of the steps, she paused, turning back to look up at the courthouse one last time. Not with relief exactly, Soren thought, watching her face. Something quieter than relief. Something closer to finally, fully exhaling after holding her breath for the better part of a year. "It's over," she said softly. "The part with Casper is," Soren said, guiding her toward the waiting car. "The part that's actually ours. That starts now." Bologna in early autumn had a particular kind of light. Warm, low, golden through terracotta rooftops. And Lyra had chosen her studio location specifically for the way that light fell through the tall east-facing windows every morning. Soren noticed it the first time he visited, 3 weeks after the trial ended, standing in the doorway of a space that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and sawdust. It had taken her exactly 12 days from the verdict to sign the lease. "You didn't waste any time," he said, watching her arrange a set of restoration tools along a long work table with the same careful precision she used to organize his medications during the blind months. Everything exactly where her hands expected to find it. "I've wasted enough time," Lyra said, not looking up from the brushes she was sorting by size. "Months hiding under someone else's name. A year, believing I owed my life to a debt that never existed. I'm not interested in wasting any more of it." The studio was modest by design. 2 large rooms, one for restoration work, one that would eventually become a small gallery space for pieces she planned to authenticate and display before their eventual public sale. She'd used a portion of her own inheritance, separate from the sterling vault entirely, to fund it. Nothing here had come from Casper, from Leo, from anyone who might one day claim a stake in what she built. It was hers alone, built from nothing but her own 2 hands, and a reputation she was determined to earn honestly this time. "The first pieces from the vault auction arrive next week," she said, finally looking up at him. "Authentication, cataloging, condition reports, work that should have been done decades ago, if my family hadn't been so obsessed with keeping everything hidden. I want to do it properly, publicly. No more secrets sitting in a cellar because someone was afraid of what people might ask." Soren crossed the room slowly, taking in the space, canvases already stacked carefully against one wall, waiting for her attention, a set of magnifying lamps positioned near the window where the light was best. It was strange, watching her build something entirely her own, after months of watching her survive inside other people's plans. "You look different here," he said. "Different how?" "Steadier, like something finally settled." He paused. "I used to be able to tell your moods without seeing your face. I'm having to relearn how to read you now that I actually can." That earned a small, real smile, the first one he'd seen from her in days, that wasn't shadowed by exhaustion or grief. "Maybe that's fitting," she said. We're both relearning things. It was true, in more ways than either of them had fully discussed yet. In the weeks since the trial, Soren had spent most of his time not in Bologna, but in Geneva, Zurich, and a handful of quieter cities across Europe, meeting with men he'd built his empire alongside. Old contacts, old debts, old obligations that didn't simply dissolve because he'd decided he wanted a different kind of life. Orion had helped him navigate most of it, but the final decisions had all been Soren's alone to make. He told her about it now, sitting across from her at the small table in the corner of the studio, sunlight slanting low across scattered restoration tools between them. "I've spent the last 3 weeks dismantling the Vance Syndicate," he said. "Not selling it off, not handing it to a successor, ending it. Legitimate businesses transferred to Orion, who actually wants to run them properly. Everything else," he paused, choosing the words carefully, "everything else, closed, permanently. No more shadow contracts, no more favors owed in blood, no more men who answer to me because I frightened them into it years ago." Lyra's eyes widened slightly. "That's not a small thing, Soren. That world doesn't usually let people simply walk away." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't, normally. But I spent months blind, dependent on people I used to command, learning what it felt like to need someone, rather than be feared by them. I don't want to go back to being a man people fear. I want—" He hesitated, something unfamiliar in his own voice, an honesty he wasn't used to speaking aloud. "I want to be someone you don't have to worry about disappearing into danger every time I leave a room." She reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture so familiar from their months in the chalet that for a moment it felt like no time had passed at all. Except now, she could see the way he looked at her when he said it, and he could see the way her face softened in response, and neither of them had to guess anymore. "I'm not asking you to become someone you're not," she said quietly. "I know. I'm not doing it because you asked. I'm doing it because I finally understand there's a difference between the man I built out of fear and the man I actually want to be." He turned her hand over gently in his. "You saw that man first, before I could see anything at all. I just needed the rest of the world to catch up." Outside, Bologna's evening bells began ringing somewhere across the rooftops, marking the hour with the same unhurried rhythm the whole city seemed to move by. Lyra glanced toward the window, toward the last of the golden light fading into blue dusk, and something in her expression settled into a kind of peace Soren hadn't seen on her since long before Venice. "I'm not the maid you hired to read you poetry in the dark anymore," she said, half a smile in her voice. "No," Soren agreed, standing, drawing her up with him. "You're the woman who built something entirely her own, out of the wreckage everyone else left behind. That's considerably more impressive." She laughed, a real, unguarded sound that filled the quiet studio. And for the first time since the bullet that took his sight, since the wedding that nearly took her freedom, Soren let himself believe that whatever came next, they would finally be building it together, in the light, with nothing left hidden between them. Lake Como in late autumn was quieter than either of them expected. The summer crowds long gone, the water gone still and silver under a sky the color of brushed steel. Soren had rented a small villa on the eastern shore, deliberately modest compared to the grand estates that lined the water further south, because he wanted this weekend to belong to just the two of them, without the weight of everything either of them owned or had lost. They arrived on a Friday evening, the drive up from Bologna quiet and easy in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after months of tension. Lyra spent most of it with her head against the window, watching the hills roll past, occasionally reaching over to rest her hand on his knee without saying anything at all. Soren had learned over the past weeks that her silences meant something different now than they had in Venice or Verona. Not fear, not grief, just the quiet of a person finally allowed to simply exist without bracing for the next disaster. They walked along the water that first evening, the lake so still it looked like glass, mountains reflected upside down in the surface. Neither of them spoke much. It didn't feel necessary. It was the second night, sitting on the villa's small stone terrace with a bottle of wine between them and the lights of a distant village blinking across the water, that Soren finally said the thing he'd been circling for weeks. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me get through it before you say anything back." Lyra set down her glass, giving him her full attention, the way she used to when he'd start talking in the dark of the chalet, back when his voice was the only thing either of them had to hold on to. "When I was blind," he began, "I used to lie awake most nights and think about all the things I'd lost. My sight, obviously, but also control, real control, the kind I'd spent 15 years building an entire empire around. I couldn't walk into a room without someone's hand at my elbow. I couldn't read a contract, couldn't recognize a threat until it was already too close. Everything I used to be, gone in the space of one bullet." He turned his wineglass slowly between his fingers, watching the reflected candlelight move inside it. "And somewhere in the middle of all that loss, you walked into my life reading me poetry, because I couldn't hold a book steady enough to read it myself." "I remember," Lyra said softly. "I used to think I fell for you because you were kind to me during the worst months of my life. That would have been reason enough. But it wasn't just kindness." He set the glass down, finally meeting her eyes directly. "You never once treated me like I was broken. Every guard I had, every doctor, every associate who came to check on me, they all spoke to me like I was something fragile that needed managing. You argued with me. You laughed at my temper. You told me, more than once, that I was being an insufferable ass about my own recovery, and you were right every single time." Lyra's eyes glistened, but she stayed quiet, letting him finish. "Regaining my sight," Soren continued, "was supposed to be the thing that saved me. I thought that for months, get my eyes back, get my life back, go back to being the man I was before the shooting. But it wasn't my sight that saved me, Lyra. It was you. You saved me long before I could see your face, and you kept saving me through Venice, through the vault, through every disaster this past month threw at us. I don't think I've said that plainly enough, and I wanted you to hear it, clearly, without a crisis happening around us for once." For a long moment, Lyra didn't say anything at all. She simply looked at him, tears finally spilling over, though her expression held nothing like the fear or grief from the ballroom in Venice. This was something else entirely, something that looked, Soren thought, almost like relief at finally being allowed to feel something without needing to survive it first. "I loved you before you could see me," she said finally, voice unsteady. "I used to be terrified of that. Terrified that if you ever got your sight back, you'd look at me and realize I was just the maid who happened to be convenient during the worst months of your life, that the connection between us was only ever the darkness talking, not anything real. And now? Now I've watched you look at me every single day for the past month," she said, a small, wet laugh breaking through the tears. "And you haven't once looked away, like I was less than what you imagined. If anything, you look at me like—" She paused, searching for the words. "Like I'm more." "You are," Soren said simply. "You've always been more than I could have imagined, even in the dark." He reached across the small table between them and took her hand, the same gesture that had carried them through the chalet, through Verona's cold railway platform, through every crisis this past month had thrown their way. Except now, for the first time, there was nothing left hanging over it. No debt to settle, no threat to survive, no secret still waiting to surface. "I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give," he said quietly. "Not marriage, not promises. Neither of us has earned the right to make yet. I just wanted you to know exactly what you mean to me, without a wedding to crash or a courtroom to win first." Lyra leaned across the table and kissed him, slow and unhurried, the lake water lapping softly against the shore below the terrace, the distant village lights blinking steady across the still surface like something patient and permanent. "For what it's worth," she murmured against his mouth, "I'm not interested in obligations either. Not to my family, not to old debts, not to anyone's expectations of who I'm supposed to be." She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, something bright and unguarded shining through the last of her tears. "I want this, freely, because it's real, and because for the first time in longer than I can remember, nobody is making this choice for me." Above them, the sky had cleared just enough to show a scatter of stars over the mountains, and Soren thought, watching her smile in the candlelight, that he'd trade every year of sight he'd ever lost for exactly this moment. The two of them, finally, choosing each other with nothing left to hide. Snow had come early to the Alps that year, dusting the peaks around the chalet in soft white weeks ahead of schedule, and Soren thought, walking up the familiar stone path for the first time in over 2 months, that the mountains seemed to know something worth celebrating was finally happening here. The chalet itself had been transformed. Where once it had stood quiet and closed off, a hiding place for a blind man and the woman pretending to be nothing more than his caretaker, it now stood open, lights blazing warm from every window, a discreet banner strung across the entrance announcing, in elegant lettering, the launch of the Sterling Foundation for Art Restoration and Access. Caterers moved between the main hall and the terrace. A string quartet, considerably smaller and considerably less pretentious than the one at Casper's ruined wedding, played near the fireplace, where Soren used to sit blind and brooding through the worst months of his life. 70 days. That's how long it had been since Venice, since he'd walked into that ballroom with his sight restored and no plan beyond finding her. It felt, standing here now, like a different lifetime entirely. "You're staring at the door again," Orion said, appearing at his elbow with 2 glasses of champagne, handing one over. "You did that constantly during the blind months too, staring at doors you couldn't actually see, like you were willing them to open faster." "Old habit," Soren admitted, though he took the glass anyway. "Well, this time you can actually see her walk through it." Orion nodded toward the entrance just as it opened, and Lyra stepped inside, brushing snow from her shoulders, laughing at something one of the guests had said. She looked entirely different than the woman who'd fled her own wedding 2.5 months earlier, not because anything about her had fundamentally changed, but because everything that had been hidden then was fully visible now. No fear behind her eyes when she scanned the room, no flinch when someone approached too quickly. Just steady, quiet confidence, the kind that came from finally standing in a life she'd chosen, rather than one that had been forced upon her. She found him near the fireplace within minutes, slipping her hand into his without ceremony, the gesture so natural now it barely registered as anything but instinct. "The first pieces from the auction previews are getting incredible interest," she said, practically buzzing. 3 museums have already reached out about long-term loans once the collection's fully cataloged, and the foundation's already received enough in early donations to fund a full restoration apprenticeship program in Bologna. You built all of that in 70 days, Soren said, watching her with something that felt suspiciously like pride swelling in his chest. We built it, she corrected. You funded half of it without me asking. Don't think I didn't notice. An anonymous donor's prerogative. Not anonymous to me, she smiled, tugging him gently toward the terrace doors, away from the noise of the party, toward the quiet, where the mountain air was cold and sharp, and the stars had already begun scattering across a clear evening sky. Outside, the view stretched exactly as it had that first morning Soren had ever truly seen it. The same peaks, the same valley lights blinking far below, the same wide, humbling expanse of sky. Except now there was nothing left underneath it waiting to collapse. No debt hanging over Leo's manufactured desperation, no threat from Casper's schemes, no fear that the next knock at the door might bring danger instead of dinner guests. Casper Thorne was serving the first of what would likely be several years in prison, his firm's assets liquidated to partially compensate the investors he'd defrauded. Leo, having served the lighter sentence negotiated through his cooperation, had written to Lyra twice since his release. Letters she hadn't yet answered, though she'd told Soren quietly, just once, that she thought someday she might. Not forgiveness exactly, just the possibility of it, left open, the way she left most things open now, rather than sealed away out of fear. I used to think this house was the safest place in the world, Lyra said, leaning against the terrace railing, looking out over the valley. Back when it was just the two of us, hidden away, no one else knowing where to find you. I thought safety meant staying invisible. And now? Now I think we were never actually safe here, she said. Not really. We were just hiding from something that eventually found us anyway. This, she gestured back toward the warmly lit chalet behind them, the music, the guests, the foundation launching under its roof. This is what safety actually looks like. Not hiding, standing in the open, with nothing left that anyone can use against us. Soren stepped closer, wrapping an arm around her against the cold, and for a long moment they simply stood together, watching their breath fog in the mountain air, the party's warm light spilling out around them. I keep thinking about that night in Venice, he said eventually. Walking into that ballroom, seeing you for the first time with my own eyes. I thought that was the moment that changed everything. It wasn't. It was the beginning, he said. But this, he nodded back toward the chalet, toward the life they'd built out of the wreckage of that terrible night. This is what actually changed everything. Not crashing a wedding, building something real afterward, together, out in the open, where nobody gets to threaten us with secrets anymore. Lyra turned in his arms to face him fully, snow beginning to drift lightly between them, catching in her hair, in the low golden light spilling from the windows behind her. Equals, she said softly. That's what I want us to be. Not the blind man and his maid, not a mafia boss and the woman who saved him. Just two people who chose each other, freely, with nothing left to hide, and nothing owed to anyone else. Equals, Soren agreed, and kissed her there on the terrace, snow falling softly around them, the mountains standing quiet and eternal in the dark, the chalet glowing warm behind them like a promise finally kept. Inside, the music continued. The foundation launched into a future neither of them could have imagined 70 days earlier, and somewhere far below in the valley, the lights of the small village blinked on, one by one, like the whole world, settling gently into the peace they'd both fought so hard to finally earn.